They laughed when the obese bride fell off the wagon, until the rancher lifted her and said, "Darlin', the only thing broken here is the idea that a fall ends the ride." The wagon had been rolling slow, creaking under the weight of a dozen wedding guests, all of them dressed in their Sunday best, the women in pastel dresses that fluttered like prayer flags, the men in pressed shirts already sweating through the collars. It was supposed to be a picture-perfect moment, the bride, Clara Mayfield, arriving at the old cedar chapel on the edge of the double-bar ranch in a horse-drawn wagon trimmed with white roses and baby's breath. The photographer had positioned himself just so, the guests had their phones raised, and the horses, two gentle bays named Sugar and Spice, had been brushed until their coats gleamed like polished mahogany. Clara had insisted on the wagon. It's tradition, she'd told her mother, who'd fretted about the heat, the dust, the very idea of a woman her size climbing up onto anything that wasn't bolted to the ground. Clara was 34, 5'6", and weighed what the scale at the clinic politely called morbidly obese. She'd spent the last 6 months losing 42 pounds, enough to fit into the gown her grandmother had worn in 1962, but not enough to silence the whispers. She'd heard them all her life, at school, at church, at the grocery store where the cashier's eyes lingered too long on the contents of her cart. She'd learned to laugh first, to make the joke before anyone else could. But today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be hers. The wagon hit a rut. Not a dramatic pothole, not a cinematic crack in the earth, just a dip in the dirt road where the spring rains had washed away the gravel. The left wheel dropped, the wagon lurched, and Clara, perched on the very edge of the bench seat because there wasn't room for her hips otherwise, felt the world tilt. She grabbed for the rail, missed, and tumbled backward in a flurry of lace and panic. The veil caught on the wheel, the roses scattered like confetti from a burst piñata, and Clara landed hard on her backside in the dust, the impact jarring her teeth and sending a white-hot spike of pain through her tailbone. For one heartbeat, the world went silent. Then the laughter started. It began with a snort from the best man, a cousin of the groom who'd been sipping from a flask all morning. Then a giggle from one of the bridesmaids, high and nervous. Within seconds, it spread like wildfire through dry grass, sharp, unstoppable, cruel. Someone's phone flashed. Another. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, felt the old shame coil tight in her gut. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook, and the gown, God, the gown, was tangled around her legs like a straitjacket. She was a beached whale in satin, and they were laughing. That's when the rancher stepped forward. Jeb Harlan was 62, widowered, and built like the oak trees that lined the creek behind the chapel. He'd owned the double bar for 40 years, had buried his wife there under a pecan tree, and had never once missed a Sunday service. He'd been standing off to the side, hat in hand, watching the procession with the quiet patience of a man who'd seen every kind of folly the Texas hill country could throw at a wedding. He'd seen brides faint, grooms puke, and once, a ring bearer get dragged into the stock pond by an overenthusiastic Labrador. But he'd never seen this. He moved faster than anyone expected. One moment he was part of the scenery, the next he was kneeling in the dust, his big, calloused hands gentle as he untangled the veil from the wheel. Clara looked up at him, tears blurring her vision, and tried to speak, tried to say thank you, or sorry, or please don't look at me, but the words stuck in her throat. "Easy now," Jeb said, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that could calm a spooked horse or a frightened child. "Ain't no shame in a fall, Miss Clara. Only shame's in not gettin' back up." He slid one arm under her shoulders, the other behind her knees, and lifted. Not strained, not grunted, not made a show of it, just lifted her clean out of the dirt like she weighed no more than a sack of feed. The laughter died as suddenly as it had started. Phones lowered, mouths hung open. Clara felt the strength in his arms, the sureness of his grip, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a burden. Jeb set her on her feet, steadying her until she found her balance. Then he stepped back, tipped his hat, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Now, who's gonna help me get this wagon back on the road? We got a wedding to finish." The spell broke. The best man scrambled forward, red-faced. The bridesmaids fluttered like startled birds. Someone found the scattered roses. Someone else righted the bench. Clara stood there in her dusty gown, her veil crooked, her makeup streaked, and felt something shift inside her, like a door she'd kept locked for years had just swung open. But the story doesn't end there. Because weddings, like life, have a way of surprising you. The ceremony went on. Clara walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her tailbone throbbing with every step, but her chin high. The groom, Tommy, a quiet man who'd loved her since they were 15 and she'd helped him pass algebra, took her hands and didn't once look away. They said their vows under the cedar beams, the scent of wildflowers and horse sweat mingling in the air, and when the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Tommy kissed her like she was the only woman in the world. The reception was held in the barn, strung with fairy lights and mason jars full of sunflowers. The band played George Strait and Patsy Cline, and the barbecue was so good it could make a vegetarian reconsider. Clara danced with her father, with Tommy, with her little nephew who kept stepping on her toes. She laughed until her sides hurt, and for once, no one was laughing at her. But the real moment, the one that would be told and retold for years, came later, when the cake had been cut and the champagne was flowing and the stars were just starting to prick the sky. Clara had slipped outside for a breath of air. The barn was loud, and her feet hurt, and she needed a minute to herself. She leaned against the corral fence, watching the horses move like shadows in the moonlight, when she heard footsteps behind her. It was Jeb. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, holding up a plate with a slice of cake balanced on it. Clara smiled. "Only if you're willing to share." He handed her the plate, then leaned on the fence beside her. For a while, they just ate in silence, the only sound the distant music and the soft snuffle of the horses. Finally, Jeb said, "You know, my Ruth was a big woman too. Not like you, different kind of big. She carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Worried about everybody else before she ever worried about herself. When she got sick, she didn't want nobody fussin'. Said she didn't want to be a burden." Clara looked at him, the cake forgotten. "What happened?" "She died anyway, but not before she made me promise to keep an eye out for folks who needed liftin' up. Said the world's full of people waitin' to fall, and not near enough willin' to catch 'em." Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they weren't from shame. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that if I could just lose the weight, everything would be okay. That people would finally see me. But today, when you picked me up, it wasn't about the weight, it was about the kindness. You didn't see a fat bride in the dirt. You saw a person." Jeb nodded. "That's the trick, ain't it? Seein' the person. Rest is just noise." They stood there a while longer, watching the stars. Then Jeb said, "You know, I got a mare in the back pasture. Name's Daisy. She's gettin' on in years, and she's put on a few pounds herself. Arthritis in her knees, but she still runs when the mood strikes her. Fast as the wind. Reminds me that slow don't mean stopped." Clara laughed, a real laugh this time, deep and unguarded. "I think I'd like to meet Daisy." "Tomorrow," Jeb said, "you and Tommy come out after the honeymoon fuss dies down. We'll ride out to the creek. I'll pack a picnic." Ruth always said the best conversations happen on horseback. The next morning, the newlyweds did just that. Tommy, who'd grown up in town and had never been on a horse in his life, nearly fell off twice, but Clara took to it like she'd been born in the saddle. Daisy was gentle, patient, and yes, a little round in the middle. They rode slow, following Jeb along a trail that wound through cedar breaks and wildflower meadows, the sun warm on their backs, the air sweet with the scent of earth and freedom. At the creek, they dismounted and spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree. Jeb had brought fried chicken, cornbread, and sweet tea in mason jars. They ate and talked. About Ruth, about Clara's grandmother, about the way love doesn't care about dress sizes or bank accounts or anything but the heart it finds. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of peach and lavender, Clara looked out over the water and said, "I used to think my story was about losing weight. About proving I was worthy. But maybe it's not about the fall at all. Maybe it's about who's there to lift you up, and what you do with the strength they give you." Jeb smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "That's the thing about kindness, Miss Clara. It don't just lift one person. It lifts everybody standing nearby. You fall, I catch you. You catch the next person. And suddenly the whole world's a little lighter." Years later, when people asked Clara how she'd lost another 100 pounds, not through surgery or fad diets, but through walking Daisy every morning, through gardening with Tommy, through living a life that finally felt like hers, she'd tell them it started with a fall. And a rancher who saw her. But the real legacy wasn't the weight loss. It was the way Clara started paying it forward. She volunteered at the local food bank, where she met a teenage girl named Marisol who'd been bullied for her size. Clara taught her to ride Daisy, taught her that strength wasn't about the number on a scale but the size of your heart. Marisol went on to start a riding program for kids with disabilities, and the waiting list stretched for miles. Tommy built a ramp at the chapel so no bride would ever have to worry about steps again. The best man, still red-faced years later, started a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. Even the photographer, who'd captured the fall in a series of now-famous photos, donated the proceeds to a body positivity campaign that went viral. And Jeb kept lifting. He taught Sunday school, fixed fences for widows, and every spring, he hosted a fall festival at the ranch, complete with hayrides, barbecue, and a wagon that no one was allowed to laugh at, no matter who tumbled out. The last time Clara saw him, he was 90, frail but still straight-backed, sitting on the porch with Daisy's halter in his lap. She'd outlived them all, that mare. Clara brought him a slice of pecan pie and sat beside him, watching the sunset. "You know," Jeb said, his voice thin but steady, "I've been thinking about that day. The day you fell." Clara smiled. "Best day of my life." "Mine too," he said. "Because it taught me something I'd forgotten. That lifting someone up don't take strength. It takes love. And love's the one thing that never gets heavy." He died that winter, peaceful in his sleep, with Daisy's halter still in his hands. They buried him next to Ruth under the pecan tree, and Clara spoke at the funeral. She told the story of the fall, of the laughter, of the rancher who lifted her and changed everything. And when she was done, she looked out at the crowd, hundreds of people, from Marisol to the photographer to the preacher who'd married her, and said, "We all fall, every single one of us. The question isn't whether we'll hit the ground. It's who'll be there to lift us up, and whether we'll have the courage to lift someone else when it's our turn." Then she led them in a song, Amazing Grace, the way Jeb had taught her, slow and sweet and full of hope. And as the voices rose, carried on the wind across the ranch, Clara felt the weight of the world lift just a little. Because kindness, like love, is a wagon that never stops rolling. You just have to be willing to climb back on. And sometimes, all it takes is one person to say, "Darlin', the only thing broken here is the idea that a fall ends the ride."